funny, I remember the very first time I gave a talk on procurement, and it was a group of lawyers involved in European law. There were about 5 or 10 in the room, and one of the partners, and actually a very large Irish firm, at the end of the session said, "Philip, it'll never catch on." So I suppose 20 years later, by the way, this, as you probably know, is the new directive. So there's fortunately, they're quite a large print because my eyes aren't so good, but it is a large document, not just one of the documents. They're due to be published on the 28th of March and will come into force, I think, probably on the 18th of April. That itself is interesting because, as you know, under European law, when a directive comes into force after publication, it isn't that the member states simply have a year or 2 years to implement it, but the directives can have some effect, in particular against a member state. So there's 2 impacts when this directive is published and comes into force in April. Firstly, it's sometimes a case of the king is dead, long live the king. Certainly my perception from the Commission's perspective is that they don't really have an interest in pursuing infringements that might have been infringements under the old directives, but wouldn't be infringements under the new directives. So even though there'll be decisions to be made about their implementation and some time gap, you do need to pay attention to them now because A, it affects what the Commission might do. Sorry, that might ask. And secondly, there are arguments that if a member state was to take actions that were inconsistent with what is envisaged in the new directives, that itself could give rise to a right of complaint or a right of action. Dermot gave me a wide choice as to what I'd talk about, and I thought I'd look at the selection process and award criteria, in particular life cycle costings. I took the selection process because, as a lawyer, we are brought in more and more at that stage, even more so than the award stage. And I think for awarding authorities, shortlisting or selecting your tenders is becoming more and more complex and more time consuming. And I confess, as I was going through the new directive to get a good handle on it, I found even my basic understanding sometimes were being challenged to recall exactly what they did. So I thought what I might do is firstly just take you through a helicopter overview of how the selection process is set out in the directives, and then I was going to take a few more juicy clauses that I think are interesting and maybe slightly challenging. So the overview, I'll come back to Article 18.2, which pops up every now and again, and that's the article that requires you as public authorities to ensure that there are not breaches of environmental, social or labour laws. Sounds a bit dull, but actually we'll come back to it, and actually there's quite a bit of I think, a challenge for local authorities or public bodies to look at that clause and see how it works. The structure of the directive starts off then with Article 56, which sets out the general principles. And as you know, the general principles for selection or shortlisting is firstly you look at the compulsory exclusions. What are the issues that you must confirm they are not guilty of, and if they are, you are probably, though there may be some derogations, obliged to exclude them. You then turn down below that to look at the areas where you may have a discretion to exclude somebody. In the directives, they give the power to the member states to decide under these discretionary headings whether the member state will impose on you an actual obligation to eliminate or exclude for these offences as well. So you've got those 2 sort of preliminary exclusionary arrangements looked at. You then turn to the next stage, which is the application of your selection criteria. And as you know, in the old directives and in the new directives, you're slightly curtailed in the criteria you can use for selecting. In the technical criteria, there's certain evidence you can use that's set out in the directive, and again it's repeated in the new directive, and you can't go beyond that in your selection of the tenderers. With the economic and financial criteria to help you select, you have a greater flexibility as to the information you may look. And as you know, if you look for certain information like balance sheets or audits or statements from bankers, if they can't give that to you, they indeed have a flexibility to provide alternative methods to show their economic standing. So that you can use to say, right, now those tenderers are all the ones that actually have the capacity, financial and technical, to do the job. You then, of course, can turn to the shortlisting. If you actually want to not shortlist all 25 that meet your selection criteria and haven't been eliminated for breaches of various professional activities or competition issues, you then have, of course, a very wide discretion to leave aside the proofs that are set out in the directive about capacity, technical and financial, and you can put in any other criteria you wish, provided they are objective and non-discriminatory, to then bring down your tenders from the 25 that were not eliminated and that met your selection minimum criteria to then have a shorter list. And I don't know if everyone thinks of it that way, because sometimes it's quite confusing with all the restrictions on what I can ask in terms of a technical question. Can I ask different questions to actually reduce my number from 25 to 5? And of course you can, and the new directives continue that flexibility, which people need to be aware of. And I say that because when I look at many of the procurements that we get involved in, public bodies very frequently, I think, get caught up in the belief that they are limited to only shortlisting based on the proofs that are set out in the directive, proofs about technical resources and 3 or 5 years previous experience. So I presume everyone knows, maybe you already did know this, that you can go beyond that when you have got your list of those with the capacity and you want to reduce and whittle down that list to a number of 3 or 5. So, going back to the layout in the directives, you have those general principles that I just described set out in Article 56, and then Article 57 comes into the exclusionary grounds. And Article 57(1) are grounds where you are obliged to eliminate them for a variety of things, like being involved in terrorism or being insolvent or being involved in fraud. They rarely arise. Most people just pass this stage by asking for some kind of declaration. But it's worth pointing out that within these compulsory exclusionary categories, there is a category of distorting competition and being found guilty of breaches of competition law. And interestingly, in this directive compared to the last one, not only if that occurs and there's a judicial decision finding somebody guilty of competition breaches, not only must you strike out that tender with a derogation I'll come back to in a moment, but also if one of the personnel is on the board of that company and has an influence in terms of the decisions of that company, if that individual who's been found guilty of a criminal offence or of competition offence, doesn't have to be even criminal, if they are on that board, you must also exclude that company. So that's quite a dramatic change, and then does require the public bodies to look quite wide, because with competition law now getting more teeth, you are finding things like that blacklisting issue that you had in the UK, you are finding companies that are getting a record, or individuals who've been found guilty of some form of anti-competitive activity. And if that's the case, you as a public authority now need to take that on board and look at the companies that they're running and consider excluding them. So it has a bite that you wouldn't expect. So we go on past that. We've got more exclusionary arrangements in Article 57(2), which is exclusion if you're found guilty by final judicial decision of tax evasion. But there's also a second bite to that, which is that if there is some evidence, and if you can demonstrate that somebody's been guilty of tax evasion or breaches of social security laws, then you'd also have the discretion to eliminate them for that. You then find that in Article 57(3), there is a derogation. I don't think it'll arise very often, but if for some reason to eliminate that particular company would have serious environmental or health issues, in other words, there was only one contractor that could actually provide those services, if it was some kind of technology for an NHS contract, and to eliminate that contractor would give you some serious difficulties, you could then sidestep those compulsory exclusions. So we then move on to Article 57(4), which is the list of discretionary exclusions that commissions give to the member states and to the local or to the public sector awarding authority. As I said earlier on, it provides not only are they discretionary, but that the member state could make them obligatory in their member state. And there the list of things like insolvency, grave professional misconduct, indications, plausible indications of breaches of competition law, conflicts of interest, and deficient performance. We'll come back to deficient performance and then misrepresentation. So you've got this list here, which you have a discretion probably as to whether you wish to eliminate people if you find evidence of them in breach of that. And then Article 57(7) is the national rules that must be adopted to implement how you will investigate these potential offences and what the defences, well, these offences and what the defences to those might be. The structure then goes out to list, as I mentioned earlier on, the selection criteria, very similar to the last directive, the means of proof for the selection criteria, and then obviously brings in the ability to look for quality assurance schemes or the European the environmental management audit scheme the Commission have adopted as well. And then interestingly in Article 63 they talk about a provision which again was in the last directive but has a very interesting bite I'll turn back to, which is using the capacity of others. And then finally Article 65, which as I mentioned is the very wide article that allows you to bring in totally new criteria provided they're objective and non-discriminatory, and you can use that to whittle down your list. Dermot asked me to be very short on slides, so I stuck to his indications, and for that I now just actually will read some of the interesting articles and take you through some of the ones that I think will be challenging. The first one is Article 18.2, which I referred to earlier on, and that provides that member states are to take appropriate measures to ensure that in the performance of public contracts, economic operators comply with applicable obligations in the fields of environmental, social and labour law established by community law, by national law, by collective agreements or by international agreements that are listed in the annex. So that sounded when I read it first as being reasonably innocuous, but when I read it again I wondered did this impose quite an onerous burden on public awarding authorities, and I think it probably does. So let me just take you through the wording again. Member states shall take appropriate measures to ensure that in the performance of public contracts they comply with various environmental and other national and international provisions. So how do you ensure in your public works contracts that these environmental, social or labour conventions or national laws are being complied with? And the annex contains some interesting conventions, including the Vienna Convention for Protection of the Ozone Layer, equal remuneration, minimum age, forced labour or right to organise and collective bargaining. So in the performance of the contracts, if you're getting a supply or a service which is being or a supply in particular which is being manufactured abroad, how do you know that the supplier, if they're based in China, if they're based in even some of the European countries, but certainly outside European countries, how do you ensure that those suppliers have complied with those conventions? Is it enough to simply say in your standard government contracts that thou shalt comply with those? I'm not sure that when the wording is member states shall take appropriate measures to ensure that those conventions and national laws are being complied with. So that's quite a challenge in terms of how you ensure that products coming from South America, products coming from China comply with these various provisions. And it is an obligation that arises in terms of what you must do with the contract, but also 18.2 clicks up now and again in terms of your rights to exclude somebody as well. So if you find that somebody has manufactured something in Bangladesh or in Thailand, not wishing to insult those countries, but there could be challenges there in terms of their compliance with a large number of interesting international conventions, like the conventions on the ozone layer. How do you know when they manufacture the products that you're buying that the manufacturing facility in Thailand, in Bangladesh, isn't actually emitting products into the ozone layer? At the very least, you want to check that those countries have signed up and are signatories to those countries. So, moving on to another provision which I think requires a bit of reflection. I mentioned in Article 57.4 that there's a number of discretionary provisions. Sorry, but before I go to that, I go to the information you can ask for. In 56.3, it provides a solution to one of the problems we always face, which is when you get your documents in from the shortlisted tenders, particularly in a large project where there's a lot of documentation asked for, I won't say it's inevitable, but it is very, very common that some of the documents are missing. And as lawyers, we're often brought in to advise a public body saying, you know, we've got 10 tenders, but this tender didn't give me any of his financial statements whatsoever. And this tender forgot to give me his banker statement, or this tender forgot to give me a performance promise or promise of being able to provide a performance bond. What do I do? And prior to the new directives, as lawyers, we would usually say, well, there's an issue of proportionality. If it's a really minor item that they forgot to give you, maybe there was not 2 directors that signed the application form when they should have had 2 and they only signed 1, we would generally say, well, there's a question of proportionality. and to eliminate somebody for something that's really, really minor may bring you into this Tideland case where you must act in some way that's proportional. So we'd say, well, if it's a very minor one, but the substance of what they're doing is there, I think on balance you should not eliminate them, provided, of course, you apply the same rule to everybody else. But we probably would have said, if it's quite fundamental, if they haven't given you the 5 contracts that they were going to give to you, indicating the previous work they did, we'd have said that's quite fundamental, and to leave that out, I think, is going too far, and that's being too discretionary, because everybody had a time limit to get this into you, and if they haven't got that by the time limit, to give them an extra week to get that in, that may be unfair to them. That's the way we approached it. Listen to the wording of the new directive. For selection, where information or documentation to be submitted by economic operators, tenderers, is or appears to be incomplete, okay, I've got used to that, or erroneous, that's unusual, or where specific documents are missing, contracting authorities may, unless otherwise provided by the national law, I don't think the UK government or the Irish government or very few governments are going to make it a strict law that if anything is missing at the stage of submitting the pre-selection documentation, that you must eliminate them, because that actually would be, SMEs would be up in arms and you'd have a lot of problems. So assuming that national law doesn't do that, then the awarding authority shall request the economic operators concerned to submit, supplement, clarify or complete the relevant information or documentation within an appropriate time limit, provided that such requests are made in full compliance with the principles of equal treatment and transparency. That simply means that if you allow him put in his audited accounts, you must allow her put in the audited accounts as well. So that's obvious. But what's very different from the last directives is that if there's a missing document or incomplete documents, you now have the discretion to allow them submit that in a limited period of time. I think that's quite a big change. So again, if I'm sitting with the question of, do you exercise your discretion? 10 tenderers have submitted a complete document, but 1 tenderer has left out something quite fundamental. You know, the reality is of the awarding authority, if that tender is a really well-known tender, and they'll know most of the tenders for most projects, there will be an inclination, and I think it's probably a good inclination, to say this was an administrative error. We know that they exist, they've been around for 10 years. Shall we allow them to submit the missing documents? Of course, and that sounds good, and I think that probably is good, because humans are putting these documents together all the time, and we know humans make errors. And we know that the first stage, particularly for SMEs, can be quite difficult to get all the documentation together. But of course, from your perspective, you then can get into an ongoing delay, because you then give the documents to your evaluation team, and they go through it and they find actually 3 other tenderers left out another document that was actually less important that we haven't noticed. So you will be brought into this sequence of actually then giving them a second chance to put in their documents, because you can't be discriminatory. So I think it's a good provision, but it is actually going to cause some delay unless you're very assiduous at the beginning in seeing what is missing. And I think that can only be done by the evaluation panel, because it could be an incomplete document, or it could be an erroneous document. How do you know if it's erroneous? So there'll be a bit of toing and froing in this one, because you'll find then that you'll be writing to somebody saying you are rejected for this reason. Maybe your document didn't show enough turnover, and they come back and say, well, actually that document was erroneous. I'm now telling you that. Will you now let me put the document in again? So you're going to get this back and forth. You have to draw the line somewhere, but it's a real live issue that's going to affect you, I think, every single day. I know for a major project recently, we had 27 consortia of architectural firms, international architectural firms, submitting to be shortlisted. And it's taken a long number of weeks, in fact months, to shortlist these tenders, because it's a major project in a major, will have a major visibility in a time of recessions, when certainly in Ireland, and I suspect to some extent in the recession in the UK, architects are looking for business. So when you get 27 bundles, each of which is this high off the ground, showing I want to be in this, I want to be shortlisted to bid, it is going to impose an administrative burden on all the awarding authorities. So picking up another, I think, interesting change in the selection process, it also provides the first time the following, and this is in the section of 57.4G, where they are dealing with your ability to eliminate somebody. And 47.4G says, where economic operators where the economic operator has shown significant or persistent deficiencies in the performance of substantive requirements under a prior public contract, a prior contract with a contracting entity, that would be utilities, or a prior concession contract, which led to early termination. Okay, that's maybe slightly unusual if it's a supplier or a construction contract. Damages, well, that actually liquidated damages for being late, or damages for the final project not being completed properly, you bring in another tender to tidy it up, or comparable sanctions. You may eliminate them. So just go over that again. You now have the power to eliminate somebody because on other public contracts he's been providing poor performance. That's been one of the holy grails to some extent, because public bodies are always saying to me, listen, we know this contractor. I get involved in lawyers get involved in construction probably more than supplies because of the value side of it. But a particular contractor has been providing poor performance and we'd like not to select him. Well, at least this clause now creates that possibility to eliminate him. And I'm talking about elimination now, and actually you can ask Sarah questions later on about maybe marking them down in terms of information you get about their kind of performance, because Sarah gives a very good lecture on that, and we'll ask Sarah later on, I'm sure. But this provision, I'm now moving into the other speakers. Who's the speaker? Kira's 20-minute slot, so I've got another 20 minutes, isn't that right? So how will you implement this? Firstly, if you're going to implement this, you're going to have some kind of monitoring system within public sector to allow you to get the feedback that this particular contractor was terminated early, or there was a major arbitration following that project and there were liquidated damages applied. And you then have at least the power to begin to examine them. There is unfortunately a kickback. So the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh. Having given you the power to eliminate somebody for poor performance, the directives then go on to say that a contractor finding himself in this situation may provide evidence to the effect that he's adopted measures sufficient to demonstrate its reliability despite the existence of the ground for exclusion. And that could be he shall prove that it has paid or undertaken to pay compensation in respect of any damage caused by the criminal offence or misconduct. Now, the way this is worded, it is really looking at the grave professional misconduct exclusion or the competition breach exclusion, which they can also cure by this process. But it also is aimed, though it doesn't come out of the wording quite so obviously, it is also aimed at this deficient performance. So they can come back to you and say, I've now taken steps which would include clarifying the facts and circumstances, collaborating with the investigating authorities. I've taken concrete technical, organisational and personnel measures that are appropriate to prevent further criminal offences or misconduct. And these are cumulative. So even though there is a defence and you will tend to get dragged into having to examine these issues if you're going to exclude somebody, it is, I think, a very positive step, because it's going to force the contractor, who had a lot of claims and counterclaims and a large arbitration, and they were found to have done a number of breaches, they are going to have ready for you, or produce very quickly for you, a report hitting all these targets, the personnel that were involved, how they now address this situation going forward. So even if you use this clause and you get back something, I think you are going to force them, because they're going to be terrified, because if you exclude them for this, then so likely will every other contractor do this. So it's a huge tool, and a tool you can use, even though at the end of the day you may not actually bring it to the very end and kick them out. But you'll force them to look at their what they've done wrong very seriously.
So if we leave it there and we'll cover more maybe in questions, or have you one more you'd like to?
I think I will jump just to one issue, if I may, which is the contract award criteria and life cycle costing, simply because I suppose part of the job for a lawyer is to tell people on both sides of the fence the way the world is moving. And the 2020 programme for Europe is looking very strongly at sustainability, climate change issues and energy efficiency. And the wording in the award criteria is, I think, pushing all the public bodies now to look at the true life cycle costings. So just to be very quick, Dermot, if you're going to allow me without squeezing me, though that thought actually becomes more appealing. It says, the award criteria shall be the most economically advantageous tender from the point of view of the contracting authority shall be identified on the basis of the price or cost using cost effectiveness approach, such as life cycle costings. Now, If you look at the UK Treasury Green Book, which you all must follow for capital appraisals, or in Ireland we have a similar thing, for every capital appraisal, before you are allowed sign off on a project, you are required to look at the cost, the cash cost, the actual cost of implementing this project. And I would put it to every public body here and in other countries as well, that the inconsistency between putting forward a capital appraisal form to say this is a good project, we're going to build this building, this hotel or this office block or this sewage treatment plant, but you haven't actually detailed out the direct costs to you of implementing this, which will certainly at the very least include energy costs. So how somebody can do a capital project without asking the tenderer to estimate what his energy costs will be, I don't know how you can do that and at the same time comply with your Green Book or any other government requirements for capital appraisal which ask you to look at the cost implications of this project. So once you look properly at your appraisal route, you're then brought into these directives which says, yes, you must look at the cost relating to the acquisition, the cost of use, such consumption of energy, maintenance costs, and then end-of-life costs. So they're the obvious ones that you can see because they're cash in your department or your public body's budget, which you really must ask the tenderers to help you bid. Give the bid costs, give their life cycle costs, give their energy costs. Secondly, you're now facilitated or will be encouraged to look at the environmental externalities, which is what the Minister referred to a moment ago, linked to the product. So that means looking at the emissions. What is the cost of the carbon in this project as opposed to another project? And again, this is definitely where we're going. And the Commission wants you to begin to look at this, because as soon as you put something like this into your tenders, the supply chain, because the private sector reacts very fast, the supply chain will begin to look at their whole supply chain carbon footprint, their emissions of inappropriate substances, and that will change the way the supply chain operates. It'll make the European sector more competitive, more innovative in providing products that are less consuming of carbon and dangerous substances, and will also have huge savings over the life of the product for the public sector. So I think this is a very dramatic change, and I'll end before I get squeezed on that note.
Great.
Because it is a big step change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Minister referred to that in her speech. Who's going to develop the methodology? And this is a challenge now to the Commission, and the Commission itself doesn't know whether it can do it or does somebody else need to do it.
Well, there are several done already. If you look at the directive on procuring vehicles, there's a pricing for the emissions on vehicles. And the Green Book from the UK Capital Appraisal, UK Treasury, has some indications of how they'll begin to evaluate. So it is happening.
Okay, this has been a brilliant start to the day. I think you're all three real experts here. So before we go to coffee, questions, comments, observations. And I'd like not to be the one to start because I know you always have questions because I've been watching you there. Jack, go ahead.
Quick question about life cycle costing. I mean, you referred to emissions, but I think as I recall from the Recycles and Direct Use Directive, there's reference to the United Nations document about how life cycle costing really be addressed. And that goes much further than emissions. That actually builds right back into production methodology, subcontractors, the way in which product is sourced methods of sources. Doesn't that mean that in reality, rather than being a more efficient and more cost-effective way to put it forward, it's going to make life very expensive for public bodies? They're going to have to audit this process.
I'm not sure about the auditing, Jack, but there will be developed, as you have for the vehicles purchasing requirement, there will be a pricing formula. You will, yes, have to ask the supplier for the estimated quantity of their emissions of various substances, the carbon being the obvious one. You will be able to take that in a table and very quickly do a pricing formula and say the cost over 20 years of this Ford Fiesta versus a Toyota Prius is going to be so much in terms of externalities. So the mathematics is quite easy. I don't see why you can't, but maybe Ms. Sarah or somebody might help me. I don't see why you can't make that a condition of the contract, that they will stick to that, and you monitor during the course of the vehicle's life or the building's life, you monitor the energy consumption or the emissions, and you penalise them financially if they don't meet what they promised they'd give you.
But isn't it the case that if you look at the directive in detail, that the emissions is just an opening shot? I mean, the Commission reserves to the Revenue Directive the right to create new instruments,
Yeah.
which does depart it occurs to me that they're going to extend this to a much broader thing than just carbon emissions.
Well, I think they would, my own view is that if, as a public sector group, you looked at energy, even just focusing on energy, and make sure that you never bought something without getting a commitment in terms of the energy consumption of that product, vehicle or building, and put in contractual clauses to ensure that they were penalised if they didn't meet their energy consumptions, because energy is a huge part of the carbon issue. And if you look at the 2020 issue, you know, climate change is absolutely huge. And carbon is obviously a huge factor in the whole climate change. So I don't think they're going to push you into a never land of making life impossible, but I do think they want you today to require that everything you buy, well, in fact, it's so common sense. How could you possibly buy something and say, I'm going to give the contract to Dermot because he's €100, but not give it to Sarah who's €110, but over the 20 years of Sarah's product, I'll save myself €25. How can anybody purchase in that way? Which, with respect, a lot of people have been doing for a lot of the time. So
Great. Yeah.